On my 72nd birthday, my daughter flew in from Seattle, walked through the front door of what used to be my house, and handed me a birthday card with a check inside. "Dad," she said, beaming like she'd just solved world hunger. "How are you enjoying the condo I bought you? The one with the river view?" I stood there in my son-in-law's garage, smelling of motor oil and sawdust, and I said, "Sweetheart, what condo?" "I've been sleeping on a cot next to your husband's workbench for 14 months. The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might faint. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You don't end up in your son-in-law's garage overnight. It happens the way most disasters happen. Slowly, then all at once, with someone smiling at you the whole time so you don't notice the ground disappearing beneath your feet. My name is Eugene. I'm 72 years old, and for 31 years I worked as an electrician in Knoxville, Tennessee. Not glamorous work, but honest work. I raised my daughter, Melissa, alone after her mother passed from ovarian cancer when Melissa was 11. I worked double shifts, missed dinners, drove a truck with a cracked windshield for 6 years because I couldn't justify the expense. Also, Melissa could go to the University of Tennessee without owing the bank her soul. She graduated, got a master's degree in healthcare administration, moved to Seattle for a job, and met a man named Neil. From the beginning, Neil made me feel like a guest who'd overstayed his welcome, even at my own kitchen table. He had the handshake of a man who wanted you to know he was strong, the kind of smile that showed too many teeth, and a habit of finishing other people's sentences with the wrong ending. Melissa adored him. I kept my mouth shut. They married in the fall, and for the first couple years, things were fine in the way that things are fine when everyone agrees not to say the true thing out loud. Then I had the stroke. It was a mild one, my doctor said, as if there's a pleasant kind of stroke. I lost some feeling in my left hand, had trouble with words for a few weeks, needed physical therapy. I was 68 at the time, still working part-time, still living in the house I'd owned for 22 years. The mortgage was paid off. The place wasn't fancy, but it was mine. 3 bedrooms, a porch with a swing, a workshop in the back where I built furniture on weekends. I'd made every piece of furniture in that house with my own hands, including the kitchen table Melissa had done her homework on as a girl. Neil and Melissa flew out when it happened. They stayed a week. Neil spent most of that week on his phone, talking about some commercial real estate deal he was trying to close. When they were leaving for the airport, Melissa hugged me hard and said, "Dad, I don't want you to be alone out here. What if something happens and no one's around?" I told her I had neighbors. I told her I had my friend Lou from the shop, who checked on me twice a week. I told her I was fine. She looked at Neil, and he gave one of those small nods, the kind that's really a signal, not an answer. 2 months later, they came back. This time, Neil had a manila folder. He sat across from me at the kitchen table I'd built and laid out what he called a plan. The plan was this. I would sell my house, and the money from the sale would go into a joint account that Melissa and I would share. They had found me a wonderful senior living community in a suburb of Knoxville called Brentwood Pines. Independent living, he emphasized, not a nursing home. All the amenities. A shuttle to the grocery store. Social activities. I listened to the whole thing. Then I said no. Neil nodded slowly, like he'd expected that, like he was a patient man dealing with a difficult child. "Eugene," he said. He never called me Dad. Not once in 6 years. "I want to make sure Melissa doesn't have to worry about you. That's all this is." I told him I didn't want Melissa to worry either, but that selling my house to move into a place where someone drove me to the grocery store felt premature for a man who still drove himself to the grocery store just fine. He folded up his papers and said, "We'll revisit." 3 months after that, Melissa called to tell me she'd found a buyer for the house. She said it in the same tone she might use to tell me she'd found a good price on plane tickets. Casual, efficient, done. "Melissa," I said, "I never agreed to sell." There was a long pause. "Dad, Neil talked to you about this. You said it made sense." I said, "No, sweetheart." Another pause. Longer. "He told me you'd come around. He said you were on board." That was the moment I should have understood exactly what was happening. But she was my daughter, and I wanted to believe there had been a misunderstanding. I wanted to believe that this man she'd chosen, this man whose child she was carrying, she'd just told me she was pregnant 2 weeks prior, had simply gotten confused. I said I'd come to Seattle for Christmas, and we'd talk it through in person. By the time I got there, the house was already under contract. I still don't know how he did it entirely. What I know is that Neil had power of attorney documents he'd had me sign 6 months after the stroke, when I was still having trouble with my words, and he presented them as just-in-case paperwork. The kind of thing responsible families do. I signed because Melissa was crying and I didn't want her to worry. I signed because I was 68 years old and I just had a stroke, and for 3 weeks I couldn't remember the word for screwdriver. And something in me was afraid in a way I didn't want to admit. He used that power of attorney to list the house. By March, I was in Brentwood Pines. My furniture, the pieces I'd spent years building, was put into storage. Most of it, Neil said, didn't fit the aesthetic of the independent living apartment. The apartment was beige. Everything was beige. The walls, the carpet, the people's faces at dinner. I sat in the common room and watched game shows with men and women who were, some of them, 20 years older than me. And I thought, this is what disappearing looks like. The money from the house, $160,000, went into that joint account. Melissa had access. So did Neil. My monthly Social Security of $1,840 covered the Brentwood Pines fees of $2,100, with Neil making up the difference from the joint account, which meant technically he was controlling every dollar I had. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself Melissa would figure it out. The baby came in July, a boy they named Connor. I got pictures on my phone. I did not get a visit for 6 months. Every time I called Melissa, she sounded rushed. Neil says you're doing great, Dad. He says you've made some friends. I had not made friends. I had made polite conversation with a man named Harold, who thought I was someone named Gary, and a woman who brought her cat to dinner on Tuesdays. Neil was telling my daughter things about my life that were simply not true, and she was believing him because it was easier than the alternative. When I asked if I could come to Seattle for Thanksgiving, Melissa said Neil thought the travel might be hard on me given my heart. I didn't have a heart condition. I had had a stroke, which is a different thing, and my cardiologist had given me a clean bill of health the prior month. I was being erased, slowly, document by document, phone call by phone call, and I was letting it happen because I didn't want to make trouble for my daughter. That changed on my birthday. Melissa flew to Knoxville alone. Neil stayed home with Connor, she said. She walked into the Brentwood Pines lobby looking confident and happy in the way people look when they believe everything is fine. She was carrying a bakery cake and a birthday card, and she had a rolling suitcase because she was staying 2 nights. We sat down in my room, and she handed me the card. Inside was a check for $500 and a handwritten note that said, "Hope you're loving the condo. Neil found you the perfect spot. Happy birthday, Dad. All my love." "What condo?" I said. She looked up from the cake she was opening. "The condo in the East Knoxville complex. The River Bend place. Neil said he bought it for you 3 months ago. He said you were moving in after the new year." I set the card down on my beige bedspread and looked at my daughter for a long moment. She was 34 years old. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of going still when she was confused. She was going very still. "Melissa," I said carefully, "I have not seen, heard of, or been shown anything about a condo. I have been in this room for 14 months. Before that, I was in your husband's garage for 6 weeks while the Brentwood Pines paperwork cleared, sleeping on a camping cot." Her mouth opened, closed. "He told you I wanted the garage," I said. "It wasn't really a question. He told you I preferred the privacy, that I liked being able to come and go." "He said you asked to stay there," she whispered. "He said you wanted space." "I was in a garage, sweetheart, in January, in Tennessee." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've heard since her grandfather's funeral. Melissa put down the cake knife. Her hands were shaking slightly, and I watched her face do the thing that faces do when a person is being forced to reassemble the world. "Where is the money from the house?" she asked finally. Her voice had changed. Something had hardened in it. I assumed it was in the joint account. She pulled out her phone. I watched her open a banking app, and I watched her face go white. "There's $43,000 in this account," she said. The house had sold for $160,000. Neil handles the finances, I said quietly. That's what you told me, that he was better with numbers. She stood up and walked to the window. She stood there for a long time, looking out at the parking lot, her arms crossed over her chest. When she turned around, I barely recognized my daughter's face. The softness was gone. He told me you had a great room here, she said. He sends me pictures. He said you were happy. He took those pictures during his monthly check-ins. He asked me to smile. Said it would make you worry less. I didn't want to say the next part. I'd been carrying it for 9 months and hadn't told anyone, not even Lou, because I was ashamed and because I didn't want Melissa to feel guilty, and because I kept thinking it would resolve itself somehow, the way you think a pain might go away if you ignore it long enough. Last November, I said. I had a chest episode. It wasn't serious, the paramedics said, but they took me to UT Medical Center for observation. I was there for 2 nights. I asked the nurse to call Neil because I needed someone to make medical decisions if things got worse. I paused. He told the hospital that he'd informed the family and that he was handling it. He told me afterward that you were in the middle of Connor's first bad ear infection and that he hadn't wanted to worry you. Melissa made a sound I've never heard her make before, something between a gasp and a word that didn't quite form. I could have died, I said, and I said it plainly, without drama, because it was true. I lay in that hospital for 2 days thinking about whether I'd get the chance to tell you that I love you, and your husband decided that wasn't information you needed. She called him right then, in front of me. I listened to one side of the conversation. Neil's answers were initially calm, the tone of a man who believes he can manage any situation given enough time. Then her questions got more specific. The condo address, the deed, the account balance. Where exactly did $117,000 go? The calm went out of his voice. I won't recount the full conversation. It wasn't pretty, and Melissa deserves her privacy even now. What I will say is that by the time she hung up, she had the look of someone who had just learned that the map they'd been reading for years was drawn by someone who wanted them to get lost. Neil had indeed purchased a condo in his own name as an investment property, using $100,000 from the joint account. He put it in an LLC. The remaining $17,000 had gone toward renovations on their Seattle house, credit card balances, and a fishing boat he'd bought 6 months prior that Melissa hadn't known about. There was no condo for me. There had never been a condo for me. My daughter sat on the edge of my beige Brentwood Pines bed and wept in a way I hadn't seen since she was 11 years old, and we buried her mother. I put my arm around her and felt every one of my 72 years in my shoulder, but I held her until it passed. I should have known, she said. I should have visited more. I should have called you directly more. I shouldn't have just taken his word for everything. You trusted your husband, I said. That's what you're supposed to do. You're my father. She pulled back and looked at me. You raised me by yourself. You worked your whole life for that house. And I let him. She stopped. You didn't let him do anything. He hid it from both of us. That's different. I believed that when I said it. I still believe it now. The next 10 days were a legal education I'd never asked for. Melissa hired a family attorney in Knoxville named Patterson. Sharp woman. No nonsense. The kind who takes notes in pen and asks questions twice. We discovered that Neil had stretched the power of attorney beyond its legal limits. In Tennessee, a power of attorney does not give an agent the right to make gifts to themselves or to engage in self-dealing without explicit authorization. Neil had done both. Patterson said we had a strong case for financial elder abuse, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Melissa filed for separation 2 days after meeting with Patterson. Neil called me directly that evening. It was the first time in 6 years he'd called me without Melissa in the room. Eugene, he said, his voice smooth as ever. I hope we can handle this like adults. I made some investment decisions on behalf of the family that I should have communicated better. I'm willing to sit down and work through the numbers. Neil, I said, my daughter's attorney will be in touch. I hung up. He showed up at Brentwood Pines the following Saturday. I saw him through the window before he saw me, and I told the front desk I wasn't available for visitors without prior notice. Brentwood Pines has a policy about that. It was the first time in 14 months I was grateful to be there. 2 weeks after she arrived for my birthday, Melissa extended her stay indefinitely. She found a short-term rental apartment in Knoxville, enrolled Connor in a nearby daycare, and worked remotely. She started visiting me every day. We would sit on the Brentwood Pines patio in the late afternoons, and she'd bring coffee from the place on Market Street that I liked, and we would talk, really talk, the way we hadn't in years. She told me things about her marriage that I had suspected but never pressed. I told her things about the past 14 months that I'd been ashamed to say out loud. It turns out shame is lighter when you share it with someone who loves you. Neil's attorney made a settlement offer 4 weeks into the proceedings. He was willing to return $80,000 and transfer the Condo LLC into a trust for my benefit, in exchange for Melissa dropping the fraud claims. Patterson said it was a lowball offer and that we should decline. We declined. He came to Melissa directly after that. Connor was with her. She'd picked him up from daycare and brought him to the Brentwood Pines garden area, where I was teaching him to water tomato plants, which I'd been growing in pots on my patio since September. It's a small thing, but I find that small things are often the most important. Neil stood at the garden gate, looking at his son watering my tomato plants, and at his wife standing with her arms crossed, and something shifted in his face. Not remorse exactly. More like a man calculating what the optics of the next move would cost him. "You're really going to do this," he said to Melissa. "I already did it," she said. "The question is whether you're going to make it easier or harder." He looked at me. I don't know what he was looking for. An ally, maybe. Or maybe he wanted to see if I was the type of man who could be managed after all. I picked up Connor's little watering can and handed it back to him and pointed at the tomato that needed more water. Neil left without another word. The legal process took 4 months. In the end, the court ordered full restitution of the $117,000, plus penalties under Tennessee's Adult Protection Act, that amounted to an additional $42,000. The condo was sold, and the proceeds placed in an account solely in my name. Neil also lost the fishing boat, which I found disproportionately satisfying. The divorce was finalized 5 months after Melissa's birthday visit to me. I won't tell you it was clean or easy because it wasn't. Melissa grieved that marriage the way people grieve things that were real before they became something else. Messily, in waves, at unexpected moments. Connor was 18 months old and wouldn't understand any of it for years. Neil moved back to his family in Oregon and, to his credit, has maintained consistent visitation. Whatever he did to me, I try not to poison my grandson's image of his father. That's not my place, and it's not my job. And I found that holding on to that kind of anger costs more than it pays. What I did with my money was buy a house. Not a big one, a 3-bedroom rancher on the east side of Knoxville, in a neighborhood with sidewalks and 2 coffee shops and a park where I can take Connor on weekends. It has a detached garage that I converted into a proper workshop, insulated, heated, with good lighting and enough room for a full woodworking setup. First thing I built was a rocking chair. Maple, with a carved back rail, sized for a man who might spend his evenings reading. Then I built a smaller one. Melissa found a permanent rental apartment 6 blocks away. We have dinner together most Sundays. She brings Connor and he sits in his little maple rocking chair on my porch and watches the neighborhood with the absolute seriousness of a toddler who believes he is in charge of monitoring the street. I sit in the bigger chair beside him and drink my coffee and think about how strange it is that the worst thing that ever happened to me led me to a Sunday evening porch I wouldn't trade for anything. There's a thing Neil said to me once, early in the whole ordeal, when I'd resisted the first plan to sell the house. He said, "Eugene, you have to be realistic about what stage of life you're in." He meant it as a way to make me feel small, a way to suggest that my preferences and my history in the house I'd built my life in were quaint considerations, sweetly irrelevant, like a child insisting on bringing a stuffed animal to a business meeting. I think about that phrase sometimes. What stage of life you're in. What stage I'm in is this. I wake up in my own house. I make my coffee in my own kitchen. I walk out to my workshop, and I run my hands over whatever I'm building. Right now, it's a toy chest for Connor. Pine with dovetail corners and his name routed into the lid. And I feel the specific satisfaction of a man who makes things with his hands and knows exactly what they're worth. I am in the stage of life where I know the difference between someone who wants to help you and someone who wants to manage you. That distinction cost me a great deal to learn. But I know it now the way I know how to wire a circuit. Completely, with no room for uncertainty. I am in the stage of life where my daughter calls me every morning before work just to check in, where my grandson calls me Grandpa Gene and says it like it's the best word he knows, where on Tuesday evenings my old friend Lou comes over and we watch baseball and argue about the same things we've argued about for 30 years. And it is, without qualification, enough. It is more than enough. It's everything. The rocking chairs on the porch are waiting for summer. Connor's getting big enough to actually rock in his, which he thinks is the greatest technological achievement of the modern age. Last weekend, he asked me to build a castle for his toy nights, and I told him that a castle was a serious undertaking and that we'd have to start with something smaller, maybe a stable for the horses. He looked at me with the complete gravity of a 2-year-old who has decided something is non-negotiable, and said, "Castle, Grandpa Gene. I'm already drawing the plans." I used to think the hardest part of getting older was the body. The way your hands stiffen in January. The way stairs announce themselves differently than they did at 50. But sitting in that beige Brentwood Pines room on my 72nd birthday, watching my daughter's face change as she looked at a bank account that should have held $160,000 and found 43, I understood that the hardest part isn't the body at all. It's learning, late in life, that love can be used as a tool by someone who doesn't actually have any. Neil was smart. I'll give him that. He understood that a man who spent 30 years raising a daughter alone would do almost anything to avoid burdening her. He understood that pride and silence look a lot alike from the outside. He built his entire strategy around the version of me that I'd always been, the man who says, "I'm fine," and means it, who solves his own problems, who doesn't make trouble. He took the best parts of who I was and turned them into a door he could walk through whenever he needed. What I've come to understand is that what he did wasn't just about money, though the money was real, and the harm was real, and the court agreed. What he did was a failure of basic human decency, the kind that no amount of business acumen or smooth-talking can substitute for. A man who looks at a 70-year-old widower recovering from a stroke and sees an opportunity has something missing in him that can't be fixed by a settlement agreement. I don't say that with anger anymore. I say it the way you might note that a house was built without a proper foundation, factually, as an explanation for why it eventually fell. Melissa's failure, if you can call it that, was different. She trusted without verifying. She accepted the edited version of reality because the unedited one was too painful to look at directly. I understand that now. I also understand that the moment she looked at that bank account and started asking real questions, uncomfortable, marriage-threatening questions, she showed more courage than I'd shown in 14 months of silence. She chose the harder truth over the comfortable one. That's not a small thing. That's the kind of clear-eyed thinking that costs something. What it cost her was a marriage. What it gave her back was her father. I spent 14 months telling myself that staying quiet was protecting her. I was wrong. Silence, in that situation, wasn't protection. It was participation. Every week, I didn't call her directly. Every time I smiled for Neil's pictures. Every morning, I woke up on that cot and told myself it would sort itself out. I was making it easier for a lie to live. That's on me as much as it's on him. A man of my age, with my experience, should have known that the people who love you cannot fight for you if you don't let them know there's a fight. What I know now, what I built into every joint of Connor's toy chest, into every hour in that workshop, is this. Integrity is what you do when the easier choice is right there in front of you. It's what Melissa did when she asked the second question, and the third, even when the answers were destroying something she'd believed in. It's what I failed to do for 14 months, and what I try to do every day now. And resilience isn't toughness. It isn't sleeping on a cot without complaining. Real resilience is getting back up and rebuilding without letting the damage become your identity. Connor is going to grow up watching two people do that. I think that's worth more than any condo with a river view.